off now. I want to welcome you to our webinar this afternoon on sustainability challenges in logistics and supply chain. This is part of the Logistics and Supply Chain Skills Week. My name is Fergal Delaney. I'm from IPIX, the Supply Chain Management Institute. Just about Logistics and Supply Chain Skills Week, it's promoted by Ireland's Department of Transport, and it's taking place this week. It kicked off on Monday. There's a full range of events between Monday just gone and running into Saturday, the 5th of April, this Saturday coming. So you've still time to look at the Logistics and Supply Chain Skills Week webinar calendar and see whether there's any events which would be of use to you. It's a combination of virtual and in-person events. Logistics and Supply Chain Skills Week, it's a nationwide initiative and it spotlights career opportunities, green and digital innovation, and it highlights Ireland's leadership in creating sustainable, resilient supply chains. This afternoon's webinar will cover sustainability challenges in logistics in the supply chain. If you have any questions as we go, please use the Zoom chat. You can key into the Zoom chat. I'll keep an eye on it. And we'll get back to you at the end of today's hour, or if we don't manage that, we'll email you with a response if necessary. And just a note that this afternoon's webinar is being recorded. So the agenda for today is that we've got two parts to today's presentation on sustainability challenges. The first piece is about challenges in decarbonising the freight distribution logistics sector, and that's going to be led by Aidan Flynn, who's the CEO of the Freight Transport Association of Ireland. Second part of the presentation today will be on greenhouse gas Scope 3 emissions, and it will be led by two speakers, Dr. Yvonne Delaney, who's the president of IPIX and the Associate Professor of Supply Chain Pathways in UL, and Dr. Gerald Nolan from UL. And then, as I say at the end, we'll take any questions or comments that have come as we've gone. So straight away, I'll hand over to Aidan to pick up decarbonising freight distribution in the logistics sector. Aidan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Fergal, and thanks to Fergal and his colleagues for organising this webinar as part of Logistics Supply Chain Skills Week. Thanks for joining as well. I think this is a very important topic for Ireland, but specifically we're focused on the freight distribution and logistics sector. I'm the Chief Executive of the Freight Transport Association, and this is a topic that we have been invested in for quite a number of years, and I'll talk a little bit about that during the presentation. And I'll also introduce a report that we published in July of last year, the first one that we published focusing on this particular perspective. So that's fine, Fergal, if you move on. I tend to start this presentation kind of setting the scene, as it were, kind of clarifying what the size of the market is when we talk about commercial fleet. Was a lot of you may know this, it is still relatively important in terms of understanding the challenges that we're faced with in terms of transition. So there's around 43,000 heavy goods vehicles in the national fleet in Ireland. Actually, 50% would be in what's called operator license or the haulage sector, and the other 50% would be in the own account sector, those that would be involved in the distribution of their own goods, including the likes of local authorities and so on. The fleet has we've around 360,000 light commercial vans, so there's just over 400,000 commercial vehicles. I think there's around 15,000 passenger vehicles on top of that, but we're in around the 400,000 commercial vehicle fleet for this country. Of that, at the moment, might be some slight changes on the HGV side. There's around 35 to 40 electric vehicles. We've got over 3,000 electric vans, which represents less than 1% of the total fleet. Gas, actually, there's 170 HGV gas trucks now, mostly certified 100% biomethane. and representing obviously an even smaller proportion of the total share. As we know, transport accounts for 21% of greenhouse gas emissions, and commercial fleets account for 51% of the total transport emissions. So the purpose of the presentation is to, I suppose, highlight that we understand our contributions, but also to demonstrate ambition to change, as well as articulating as best as we can suggestions to government and stakeholders to help assist with that change. Thanks, Fergal. On FTA Ireland, we've actually been working on this piece even longer than 2017. We have an annual audit for commercial fleets called TruckSafe, and we built in a number of questions around environmental management and fuel management into that going back to 2011. But we established an alternative fuels working group in 2017, which was aligned with the Causeway project headed by Gas Networks Ireland to deliver 14 publicly available CNG fueling sites for trucks. To date, in 2025, there's 6 publicly available fueling sessions as service stations for trucks. And there's quite a bit of learning that has come out of that project going on now, 8 years or so, which is very, very important in understanding the challenges for implementing and introducing other alternative fuels to support the freight distribution sector. But the other thing which is really important is, and which we hear a lot of, is, right, we know that we have to do something, but how do we do it? Where's the roadmap? And the report that we'll be introducing in a while kind of sets out to clarify this from a legal perspective, both from a European perspective. We know the European Green Deal, Fit for 55, has legislated for the requirements to change. And, you know, in Ireland, the Climate Action Plan in 2023 actually was the first climate action plan published in this country that had a chapter on freight and recognizing the freight involvement in decarbonising. So it's all very, very new to everybody. The haulage strategy, which was published in 2023, has a high proportion of the actions in it relating to decarbonisation as well. There is a growing amount of legislation and also other requirements to indicate that this isn't going to go away anywhere, and businesses need to start strategizing about how they will transition. But there are questions to be answered. Next slide, please. So if we look at some considerations in relation to decarbonisation, we have a growing population, and indications are that by 2040 the population will by an additional 1 million people. Of course, when you have a growing population, you have increased demand for freight and freight services. And that needs to be considered in any government plan to help support that transition. The other challenge for Ireland, of course, is that 50% of the population is on the East Coast and the rest is dispersed. So understanding how to build efficiencies into freight distribution is going to be massively important. You know, and that is kind of considered in the rail freight strategy, for example. But it is a dispersed population which needs to be considered because some of the strategies, actually, national demand management strategy, are looking to reduce the miles driven by over 20%. How do you do that for a freight distribution system that is looking to service a growing population all around the country? Over 90% of goods arrive into and out of our ports. So we are very heavily dependent and will be into the future on trucks for efficient distribution. Rail freight needs economies of scale to be viable, at least 300 kilometres distance for rail freight. And in actual fact, the vast majority of goods that are moved on the roads are movement of goods to household, retail wholesalers, factories and roadworks, building sites, and that constitutes nearly 76% of total kilometres driven, which is heavily reliant on the just-in-time logistics model. Thanks, Fergal. So in terms of the government plan, and I'm a bit cheeky with the pie in the sky, however, we want things to happen and we know it will happen. The challenge is the timing. How close to the timings will we be, or how far away from those timings will we be? and what will the impact if we miss those targets be in terms of the buy-in to change? And they're all real important considerations, because we all know if someone sets a target and you go, that's pie in the sky, absolutely no chance of us hitting that target, you effectively turn off and don't even plan for change. So we need to be very, very careful. But the target in 2025 was 175,000 passenger EVs, 20,000 commercial, 700 low emission HGVs, 300 EV buses, expansion of electrified rail services. In 2025, at the moment, I think we've 40,000 passenger EVs. We've 3,000 commercial vans, and we have a lot lower number of low emission HGVs. So you can see the challenge that's been posed by this. And in fact, the coach and bus sector are more inclined to be moving to electric a lot quicker. And we see that through the introduction of dedicated electric services in Limerick and in Athlone, and soon to be rolled out, I think, in Galway as well. So we know there's buy-in in relation to that. And the targets for 2030 are even more ambitious. Thanks, Fergal. So as I mentioned, this is coming from the EU, and of course, the targets are set by the EU. And one of our kind of key areas in terms of our engagement on the Freight Forum and our advice to government is that we actually need a more specific decarbonising freight transport strategy for the country that can review the unique challenges that Ireland has as an island, obviously reliant on goods distributed by road, but also taking account of infrastructure challenges and other things, to go back to the EU and represent in a positive manner the challenges that we are faced, rather than going back, hey, we're not going to meet our alternative fuel infrastructure regulatory requirements, we're not going to meet this, we're going to be fined by that. Let's put a structure in place that is a lot more achievable and understandable to support everybody's understanding of the roadmap required for change. Next slide. So these are a couple of key dimensions of sustainability. We need economic, social, environmental sustainability. I think the economic one is really important because as a business, you need to be able to make sure that whatever change is happening isn't going to be at such a cost to the business that it is going to impact the sustainability of that business. But it has to be ethical business practices as well. Obviously, the social element of it is ensuring that there's fair labour practices supported by community well-being. So I think understanding your corporate governance and ability to benefit all people and clients and customers is massively important. And very importantly, of course, in the topic we're talking about is that environmental sustainability piece, is really understanding well to wheel that the practices that we are looking to introduce are legitimate practices and long-lasting, which is important. Thanks, Fergal. Because businesses need certainty, and there must be a business case to change. That is basics. And I think what we know within the association and the companies that we represent, there is massive ambition to change. There isn't a head in the sand issue, but there is a requirement to have certainty. And that certainty needs to be led by the government. And that is what we are all working towards. Going back to it, we need a more bespoke, focused, decarbonising freight transport sector strategy. Nice. Next one as well. Looking at the challenges, and apologies now because I think I've placed this slide a little bit too early, but you'll understand a little bit later. We publish two reports, one of which every year, one of which is a Manager's Guide to Distribution Cost report. And within that report over the last 8 years, we've been able to collate the averages distances travelled, the average litres per 100 kilometres, and been able to work out on average, reviewing year on year changes in costs. But we're on average 289 kilometres. This is the vehicles over 3.5 tonne. They're operating on average 29 litres per 100 kilometres. So they're burning 0.29 litres per kilometre. On average, a truck will use 84 litres per day. And the cost of that fuel is 50 cents per kilometre. And what we wanted to do is break down the actual taxes that are included within a litre of diesel, and look at the carbon tax income that's been taken just off the 43,000 national fleet. So if you just hit it again there for one button. So we can see the carbon tax is 17 cent per litre. But if we look at a truck burning 21,800 litres per year, each truck is contributing around €3,700 in carbon tax to the state. We feed that into the national fleet of 43,000 vehicles. There's over 160 million of carbon tax intake coming from the heavy goods vehicle fleet, let alone what's coming from the additional 350,000 vans. So this is just the trucks, 160 million. Go to the next slide, please. And this is the 2025 allocations by department and programme. And you can see, interestingly, of the carbon tax allocation, only 20 million is attributed in through the Department of Transport. And that 20 million is focused on greenways, EV grants of 8 million, EV infrastructure of 3 million. It's nowhere near enough to support our industry transition to zero emissions. And one of the big challenges and call-outs here for us is to review that 160 million, make it work better to support the transition to zero emissions. Next slide. So, of course, challenges or geopolitical challenges. We can even see the new president in the United States, the impact that he's having even today in relation to their policies and the impact that can have. But we're not just looking at what we can do in Ireland. We're very reliant on what happens all around. And there are ongoing issues, obviously, in the Red Sea for global supply chains, which is impacting higher shipping costs, container shortages and delays. You see the impact of the Ukraine war, you know, other potential issues with the US, China, and not just trade tensions there. These are global trade tensions, and these all feed in to the ability to meet the targets that are set out under the European Green Deal, because people tend to get distracted a little bit. Next slide. And of course, our own Environmental Protection Agency here is saying we are going to meet our own targets that we have set. Whilst we want to continue and push for a downward reduction, we cannot neglect the fact that there's a lot more work to be done and a lot more buy-in by everybody to ensure that it happens collectively. So collaboration and engagement, understanding what we need to do is massively important so we can correct these target issues we have. Next one. Yeah, so these are the two reports, 2024. As I mentioned, I alluded to the Manager's Guide to Distribution Cost report. They can be got from our website, ftai.ie, or you can email me at aflynn@ftai.ie, and I can email you copies of them. Decarbonising the Road Freight Sector report. We published that in July 2024. Next slide. So just a graphic here in relation to challenges. Of course, there's lots of challenges, so we can make lots of excuses, but it's how do we turn those challenges around to be workable and provide the certainty for businesses in terms of changing. So the demand for change, transformational change, is any change is challenging, but the type of change that's being required is massive. And the vast majority of businesses in this country are small to medium-sized businesses. So the level of anxiety around the requirement to change, but the sustainability of their business really impacts people's willingness and ability to change. So if we put it in context, the average size haulage business only has 5.9 trucks. So less than 6 trucks is the average size haulage business in Ireland. That is small to medium-sized businesses. How are they to invest in much more expensive fleet and vehicles, as well as understand their own requirements to change in a sufficient manner? So again, we need mechanisms to be able to support that massive cohort of business to be able to move. Um, Fuel, what is a viable alternative fuel? What alternative fuels suit my business? You know, these are all questions. If I invest in a gas truck, is that going to be have residual value, or is electric the way, or is hydrogen going to be the way? We know the technology is advancing at the moment. So from an electrical perspective, it's not range anxiety, it's fueling time anxiety. It's how long does it take to get the wattage into my vehicle? And of course, there is barriers. There's political barriers. Those deadlines that we met. One government has a different type of policy to another government, and we actually see this in the new program for government, where there is much more support for biomethane and HVO in the program of government that wasn't there in the previous government. So that creates challenges as well. And the biggest elephant in the room, of course, is the infrastructure and the ability to provide enough infrastructure to support the transition. Next slide, Fergal, please. Yes. So, in terms of the decarbonising road freight sector report, I wanted, when we put it together, we wanted to represent four key alternative fuels. Inver were involved in relation to hydrotreated vegetable oil, SSE on electricity, gas networks on CNG, bio-CNG, and air products on hydrogen. And it was not just about promoting each individual organization's ability to supply and provide the alternative fuels, but to demonstrate that there is availability for those alternatives right now. And whilst HVO is a drop-in replacement for diesel, there's still challenges with it in relation to certification and trust, which has been worked on. And I think in terms of the programme for government, that will be dealt with. The Department of Transport have commissioned a report on HVO, which will be published in a couple of months. Gas networks looking at bio-CNG, and this bio-CNG is really important because we have a biomethane policy for the country now to deliver up to 5 terawatts of biomethane by 2030. Electricity, of course, the infrastructure, the ability to access the grid. EirGrid published a report that by 2031, we are going to still have capacity issues, supply issues around electricity. And of course, I think the figure is more than 28%, but maybe 31% of electricity demand by 2031 is going to come from data centers. So it's how do we develop the infrastructure to be able to supply the high charging capacity requirements for trucks. And hydrogen, of course, then has its own challenges, both in terms of the availability of it, but really about the cost of the hydrogen to support a cost-effective distribution network. Next slide, please. Just quickly here, again, this is the report I benchmarked here, but if you look at operational costs, fuel accounts for over 42% of costs for a business. And I think that's when you're looking at a truck fleet, you're being cognizant of these basic cost elements, and you do not want to be, deviating too much in an upward trajectory from the average cost there. Otherwise, margins are squeezed. Next slide, please, Fergal. So what are within the report as well, I thought this was some of the most important information that came out of it. We interviewed a number of fleet operators, but we also interviewed truck manufacturers, and there was a couple of striking bits of feedback in terms of the fleet operators' view. And again, I would stress it's a considerate of zero emission type of transition, like electric vehicles. The fleet operators think there's a lack of charging or refueling infrastructure. So that's a blocker for them to be making decisions to change. Cost is obviously a big issue, the affordability, funding, risk, the tax information around it, the performance of the vehicles are untested or unchecked. Grants are lack of, not enough information, taxation. But interestingly, they felt truck manufacturers' involvement was also a blocker to transition. And from a truck manufacturer's perspective, their issues are a lot of similarities. They're worried about range issues because they want to stand over the vehicles that they're selling. They're not sure of the fuel type. They're lack of understanding in relation to government policy. But I thought this was a very interesting one, was they mentioned customer buy-in, you know, and the customers believe it's truck manufacturers' involvement. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to get the truck manufacturers and fleet operators together to work in tandem in supporting the transitional piece. Because after all, the European Union is demanding that the truck manufacturers change by specific dates. And the truck manufacturers, in fairness, have been investing millions and millions in R&D and in alternative fuels. So they're quite well ahead of under where it's going to drop with them into the future. Next slide, please. So key takeaways of a report is there is more than one solution, you know, and but there is probably a myriad of solutions and technologies to decarbonize the road freight sector. So certainly in the medium to long term, you may have a mix of bit of HVO, some gas trucks, and as you introduce vehicles, and that pushes into hydrogen at some stage. But government must support the private sector with deployment of sufficient alternative fueling infrastructure and electric charging facilities. That is clear. Develop a national decarbonising road freight strategy through collaboration and engagement with key stakeholders. And we need to be realistic about our starting point. We have different challenges to decarbonisation than mainland EU, and this must be reflected in the national decarbonising strategy. And we do need to consider new tax supports and better grants to encourage commercial fleet operators to purchase alternative fuels. There is no grant for CNG biomethane vehicles at the moment. Whilst there is grants for zero emission vehicles, we need to ask the question, why isn't there more take up of these grants if the grant is available? Next slide, please. Security of energy supply is critical for commercial fleet operators. We saw when Russia invaded Ukraine, the anxiety that crept in around the ability to have enough diesel and fuel in this country to support our fleet. The contingency planning for fuel is massively important. And we are reliant on the importation of energy. Over 80% of all the energy is imported into this country. And whilst there is a narrative that the offshore wind and onshore wind is going to deliver energy, we are delighted that that will be the fact, hopefully at a certain stage. But when will that be realistically happening? And it will be way beyond 2030, 2035, 2040 before that becomes a reality, because we're not only looking at the offshore wind opportunities, we need to be realistic that the actual onshore infrastructure to move the high energy is going to be sufficient to be able to do that. And perception is an influencer, and not always in a positive way. And we know as truck service providers, that we look at big dirty truck going into a town or here, there, and everywhere. It is an essential service for the Irish economy, and the technology is advancing as such that they are much cleaner than they were in the past. But the organisations are willing and able to change once the business case has been made available. And we need to change the narrative about that willingness and work with in a collaborative way with all stakeholders. Next slide, please. So one of the basics pieces, and I'll be very quick now on this because I know my time is up. Eco driver training, for instance, is a really good way to save fuel, to save money, and to reduce emissions. And this is a study from some training that we delivered in 2023. But effectively, it's common today. 10 vehicles can save nearly like 50,000 euro in terms of fuel cost, right? Which is 100 tons of CO2 savings. So once it's documented and applied correctly, there is massive saving, 3.2 litre per 100 kilometres. So if we go to the next slide, and we can see the Department of Transport have delivered on an action on the freight haulage strategy by introducing driver training standard, of which we were delighted to be the first organisation to be certified to that standard. But it really is a good starting point for organisations that want to get credit for really proactive engagement in decarbonisation. You may not be able to change to gas or electric or whatever, but to implement a process and system that can track your fuel burn and get recognition on this government supported eco-driver standard is really important. And we're not going to be the only ones available to do it. It could be open to anybody to apply to get that standard, and we would encourage you to do it. Next slide, please. I've mentioned that, but that's just evidence there by the manufacturer's requirements to reduce emissions by 90% by 2040, based on emissions from 2025. So there's another reason. Why do we have to change? Well, actually, the manufacturers might want to sell you a diesel truck at the moment, but they know that in a couple of years they're not going to be able to do it, perhaps because they're by 2040, which is only 15 years away. And the average age of a truck in Europe is 12 years away. So we have to start really looking at how do we introduce alternative fuels into our fleets now. Next slide, please. We can move on to the next one. Again, it's which alternative fuels. Very quickly on this, using the data that we have from the manager's guide and looking at kind of average costs, we can see the type of emissions that's there. Like diesel is emitting 56 tons of CO2 per truck per year. Bio-CNG is around 6 tons. Obviously, electric is 0. HVO is around 6 tons. Alternative fuel emission reduction, you can reduce with diesel, right? Bio-CNG is 90%, as is HVO, and obviously electric 100%. But looking at the bio-CNG, the biomethane strategy is to deliver 5.7 terawatts biomethane by 2030. And if we transition 5% of the fleet, around 2,000 trucks, onto biomethane, it would take around 11% of that target. And it would reduce significantly in terms of emission reductions. So there are opportunities there whilst the infrastructure is developed to support electrification and or hydrogen into the future. Next slide, please. Yeah, I can go to the new government focus. The last slide really was just to mention, going back to the power issue. We can't even get an interconnector between the north of the country and the east of the country, or the west and the east, have the high power that's needed to supply electric vehicles. As you saw on the slide before, 85,000 kilowatts of energy is required to charge a truck every year. An average house uses around 5,000 kilowatts a year. So one truck is multiple times a house. So we need to be kind of cognizant of that as a challenge. The new government, as I mentioned already, do have a plan, but the question is it ambitious enough to be able to deliver what's needed? Right. So look, finally, we just need to consider we're an island, small island that hasn't historically invested in infrastructure. You cannot compare us to Norway or Sweden or any other European country when it comes to alternative fuels. There has been a historical lack of investment in alternative fueling, and EU transport policy is not easily transposed into Ireland. So we don't have inland waterways to offset the movement of goods by water. Less than 1% of freight is on rail freight at the moment. So whilst there's a great opportunity to grow that, it is going to be challenging to do it in an effective and sustained way over a short period of time. And it is really good to do something rather than nothing. So start with the eco-driver training. We also need to be cognizant that we're a right-hand drive market. So building relationships and getting the trade and cooperation agreement implemented post-Brexit with Britain is really important in terms of the ability to develop economies of scale for alternative fuel vehicles. And we do have to plan to ensure ease of importation of increased volumes of alternative fuels. It's not easy to transport hydrogen, for instance. So there's a real challenge there if that's the way we're going to go. How do we get it? And given that we're going to be moving from a reliance of 80% of importation, perhaps, to be developed on the island. And the government must continue to develop trust in the industry to work collaboratively to deliver the ambitious decarbonisation targets. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Aidan. That was a fascinating look and a huge amount of data. And information for us all to mull over in terms of the logistics and decarbonisation. We're going to change direction now and look at manufacturing operations and insights from Irish and multinational organisations. And we're going to be joined by Dr. Yvonne Delaney and Dr. Gerald Nolan to take over. Yvonne, Gerald, over to you.
Thank you.
Sorry, just before you go, I'm seeing some comments or questions already in the Q&A. We welcome those. We'll get to them time permitting before the end and get back to you, okay? Thank you. Right, Yvonne?
Thank you, Fergal, and Aidan. Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. It complements some of the things we're going to talk about. Not all of them, needless to say, but it just shows that the research does stack up when you go out there to talk to the general manufacturers across the different sectors. So thanks, Aidan. And thank you, Fergal. So today we are going to cover, the insights into the Irish and multinational organisations. We had a research team which was put together at the University of Limerick, and Gerald would have been the lead researcher on this programme, or the research team, and it was also funded through the SkillNet Climate Ready Academy. As you can see there in the picture, it was made up of a research team with a wide range of different skill sets, but each of us contributed to the research in our own way. Thank you, Fergal. So just to give you a slight, I suppose, context of the amount of research that we did an extensive literature review, and the area that we were reviewing specifically related to Scope 3 emissions. Now, within I suppose the ESG goal 13 climate ready, there are Scope 1, Scope 2, which tend to be about emissions within the particular plant. But we looked at Scope 3, which is specifically outside of the plant, upstream and downstream, which I'll cover in a few moments. But we did an extensive literature review in relation to Scope 3. We also carried out about 11 semi-structured interviews across the 9 top offenders, if you want to use, for the want of a better word, in the industry that were contributing to greenhouse gases. We did about 65 surveys, and we did across 9 different industries, and we did 2 focus groups on top of that. That would be in addition to the semi-structured interviews. So you can see there that there were enablers of Scope 3 emissions, and the important thing is that we did a cross-sectoral review. Thank you, Fergal. So over to you, Gerald.
Yeah. So just one of the things we really wanted to find out. This is from the quantitative. So we as Yvonne has mentioned there, we did there was 3 strands. So we did our interviews, or in-depth interviews, semi-structured interviews. We did focus groups then with sort of very senior people. And then we did an overall questionnaire with people at all levels. So you can see the participants were senior management, non-management, middle management, junior. And we wanted to see what their awareness was and how some people were aware, but they didn't think their colleagues were aware. And then what we wanted to do is look at things like costs and knowledge and the capacity or the complexity of the things. So there were some of the barriers. So barriers and enablers were things we were looking at. Can you move on, Fergal, please, to one? Survey instrument was 9 questions. We had participants from manufacturing, pharmaceutical, healthcare, transport, computer and technology, education, food and beverage, entertainment, finance, and economic. And these are actually some of the main areas that we found were, and we have a list of those in a moment. 39% non-management, 35% middle management, 20% junior management, 6% senior management. And the results we got, we'll talk about in a moment. Could we move on, Fergal? I think it's
Yep.
Yvonne
It's
is
over
going
to
to be.
me. So as you can see there, you have got the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So the one we focused on was down on goal number 13, which is climate action. Now, I alluded to this earlier on or just to start my presentation. So we're looking specifically at climate action 13. And within climate action 13, there's scope 1, 2. We're only looking at scope 3. Back to Gerald.
Yeah, so I think it was important. I remember listening to people debating on before the general election, the local elections last year, and you'd hear people talking about things, and you really have to wonder whether even the people talking for and against the subject knew what they were dealing with. But with the three scopes, so the first scope of emissions are direct emissions controlled and owned by a company. So if smoke is coming out of stack or you're putting things into the water, direct emissions. Scope 2 are emissions caused indirectly by its energy purchases. So whatever you buy in electricity or gas or whatever else you're using goes in there. Scope 3 is everything else, and it's very often it's things that you buy in. So you might have a squeaky clean factory here in Limerick, and at the same time you might be buying in some kind of widgets from China, which have to come a long way on a ship, and who knows what's the local emissions. So all the emissions that are not covered by scope 1 and 2, both upstream and downstream. So you might be bringing things in from somewhere, you might be manufacturing and then sending them on to Mexico or somewhere. And all of those transport costs, for example, will be taken into consideration. Next one there, if you don't mind. So these were actually the main 8 suppliers or main, what you might call offenders. Now, food, construction, fashion, fast-moving consumer goods, supermarket products, I suppose, electronics, auto, and then professional services. And all of them actually, and again, all of them have a big element of freight put into them. But these are the ones we try to have a lot of our interviews concentrating on people who would have insight into these particular areas. Next one there, Fergal. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So for some companies, their direct emissions or their own footprint, their scope 1 and 2 might be quite small. As I say, you could have a very, very clean plant, but then you could be bringing in stuff from all over the place. And a lot of scope 1 and 2 are easily enough accounted for. Scope 3 emissions are embedded in parts imported and are far more challenging. Management and measuring could be achieved if management and measurement could be achieved in the top 5 multinational corporations, it would radically reduce the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Now, again, your big multinationals, they are like big empires in many cases. They would all know their tier 1 suppliers and might be able to track down. But a lot of those suppliers have suppliers, and it goes on like that. So it's quite a challenging issue. However, it's an interesting fact that if you could get those big multinationals on board, we could rapidly make progress on this whole area. Next slide there.
So our brief came from 2050 Partners, which was part of the climate or the Skills Net Climate Ready Academy. And it really was, our research was to focus on organizations and what would their solutions be for developing to address sustainability within the supply chain. So we started through our research and asking questions of the people we interviewed and the people we sent surveys to. What were the enablers? What were the barriers? But first of all, we wanted to see how prepared organizations really were with regard to scope 3. We focused on large industries with reasonably strong sustainable supply chains. And as a result of that, we produced a report which detailed everything in relation to what our research actually found. And if any of you would like a copy of that report, you can just put it in the chat, and Fergal and Gerald and I will ensure that you actually get it. Okay? Now, in relation to the corporate value chain, there are upstream and there are downstream elements. So as you can see, in relation to scope 3, you have indirect elements upstream and indirect elements downstream. if you could go to the next slide there, and I'll give a clear understanding of what comes under Scope 3, because many people in relation to upstream Scope 3 emissions may not be that clear. So take, for example, when you purchase goods or services that are coming into your organization, any type of capital goods. Now, Aidan comprehensively and very eloquently explained the whole fuel area, but the fuel energy upstream, but you will also have the fuel element downstream. You have any type of waste that is generated from your operation. Any business travel. So if you have people in your organization that are traveling internationally, you will be accountable for their carbon footprint. Also, when you will look at the downstream, we're looking at the processing of solid products. We're talking about, the end of life treatment of products. And also we're looking at any type of franchises that might be available. Thank you, Fergal. Over to you, Gerald.
Yeah. So methods. So how did we approach this? So we produced a literature review. So that was an ongoing thing over the period of time. We looked at very new literature because really this is a new subject. I mean, the whole term I think was coined about 2009, 2010, but really most of the stuff has come through in the last 2-3 years. The second thing was the semi-structured interviews. Now, within that, so we had 11 interviews. We were actually tasked to do a minimum of 5, but we actually, my colleague Yvonne is an expert at getting people, important people, influential people into these interviews and convincing them to help us out. Now, so from a conference that Yvonne was at, some of the people in the American Supply Chain Management Organization produced a very, very big, wide-ranging set of kinds of questions that need to be asked. I mean, I think there was 168 in all. We distilled that down to about 20 or 21, and then we got some other people, more local people who were involved in this area to suggest other questions. We came up with 28. It might have been even a bit too much. Each of those interviews you could consider a case study, and they provided as a basis for the other strands. Now, the other strands were focus groups. At that point, we had a lot of information from our first people. We wanted to write that up as well, but we also wanted to focus more on 3 issues really that came to the fore. One was awareness. How aware are people about Scope 3, and what were the barriers and drivers? Because a lot of the other questions we had kind of resolved. Then there was the quantitative survey, which I've given you some detail on already. And I think we had 60 or 65 results, and again, from various levels in the supply chain. And we brought the 3 strands together to write up the report as it is, as Yvonne was talking about. Could you move on there, Fergal, if you don't mind? So this is an interesting one now. Overall, it seems a lot of industry are just really starting their Scope 3 journey. Now, quite interestingly, one of our interviewees, actually openly admitted he'd never heard of the term before. And but most of the others said, yeah, we know about it. Some were extremely cued in, from some of the most surprising sources you would find. And but a lot of it is going to depend on enforcement. I mean, if it's easier for me to pay a fine than to obey the law, I mean, if the fine is tuppence, we're not going to really move anything. But if you start introducing incentives to get people to do the right thing, or penalties, we'll say. So in 2023, the EU introduced a corporate sustainability reporting directive. And then it updates and reinforces the rules concerning social and environmental information that organizations have to report. And again, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive was approved by the European Commission in March 2024. And that sets obligations for organizations to address actual and potential adverse impacts. And again, as Yvonne alluded to earlier on, a lot of this covers things like other UN goals. So the companies that are likely to be polluting the rivers of China or wherever are possibly the same ones who are not respecting human rights. So there's things like human rights, environment. Most big multinational corporations have a very, very good due diligence when they're taking on a new supplier or getting involved with any other companies about things like modern day slavery, underage people doing work, prison workers, and that kind of thing. So all of that is included as well. Next slide there. Which this is me, is it, Yvonne? Yeah.
Yes, yes.
So just verifying and quantifying those. So despite the compulsion of the EU and national legislation, so I mean, we all know we have to do the right thing. You know, you have to have your car tires at the proper depth and all this kind of stuff. But they might struggle to verify and quantify the numbers. So the big national, multinational corporations will have a lot of suppliers. And as one of the people pointed out, somebody representing a really big organization said, you know, the big international companies are like empires. They're always bringing in new parts and selling off other parts, and it sometimes takes a while to verify, you know, how everything fits together and who are the suppliers. And again, a lot of people said, well, we definitely know all our tier one suppliers, but most of those suppliers have suppliers and they have suppliers, etc. An example would be bulk chemicals coming from the oil and gas industry. Managers see very little prospect of decarbonising these chains. A similar story was with cement, for example, and cement, for, you know, the scientific ability to decarbonize that just doesn't exist. Now they are working on it, and I know there are chemists in the world who are doing work on getting that down. And again, something quite surprising from people like the cement people is they have been very invested in looking after this area. And although it almost sounds counterintuitive, like CRH are doing an awful lot of the interstates in America, they're redoing it. Most of the stuff they dig up is actually recyclable. And we're even making a point about some buildings which were built in the 80s and they were supposed to be there for 100 years, but are already knocked and they can be recycled. So, and also they don't transport things over long distances. So, you know, there are some kind of interesting aspects. Interviewees report that most of the Scope 3 emissions come from transport. So again, back to a lot of what Aidan was saying there. Goods are delivered via shipping or air and then onto trucks. Next slide.
So,
Do you want to take
in
that
terms, yeah, well, in terms of the food processing, right, this was something that actually surprised us. For those engaged, say, in the food processing, agriculture accounts for a large amount of Scope 3 emissions. Manufacturing, in actual fact, accounts for between 7 and 8%. Agriculture accounts for between 75 and 80%. And transportation takes up the balance. So there's quite an awful lot of work that needs to be done in terms of the farming and the agricultural area, in terms of changing practices so that we can have a true impact on our carbon emissions under the Scope 3. And as you can see there, the transport would probably account for around 12% if you were to look at it, which we were surprised at from the research we did. We thought the transport would be much higher. And the agriculture, we knew the agriculture was high. We didn't realize it was as high as that. Thank you, Gerald.
Yeah, so cost sustainability officers report that the key performance indicators used by large businesses are geared towards sustainable profitability. Well, I mean, that's the rationale for businesses. The whole thing is to enhance shareholder wealth, to produce profits. But they often say, and again, the people we were interviewing, for example, they were mostly the sustainability people or the people on that side of the thing, and they struggle to create the awareness on the financial side that sustainability for the planet might also be helpful to sustain businesses. And I think a lot of businesses, well, the ones that are business to business don't really worry about it too much, but the ones that are customer focused, for example, you're not going to sell a lot of Nike runners if it was emerging that it came from sort of slave labor or some sort of dubious practices. Some of our interviews suggest that there is a large knowledge gap between the financial decision makers and the sustainability teams within their organisation, but cost is cited as the biggest barrier to achieving decarbonisation of the supply chain. And there's a point here, because some of the literature we went through, particularly produced by, we'll say, the green side of the argument, suggests that, you know, change is, you know, a lot less expensive than you think, and there's quite good ways of changing things nowadays. And we find when we talk to the hard-nosed people who are making those decisions, they don't agree. Cost is still the biggest thing. Next slide there, Fergal. Economic cost. Now, here's an interesting one. So I trade as an economist, and true economic cost. One of our people posed to us: Do we do we know the true economic cost of anything? Now, economic cost isn't just what you pay for. A lot of what we get manufactured in foreign countries is done on the backs of maybe low wages to those other people. I mean, we'll see what Mr. Trump has to say this evening, but if they're going to make iPhones in California instead of in China, they're going to cost a lot more than 8, 9, or 1,000 quid. They're going to be very, very expensive. So economic costs take into consideration costs which don't necessarily feature in accountancy rules. They include the environmental degradation costs, negative health, social impacts, violation of people's rights, use of child labor, prisoners' labor, all those kind of things. And again, take any piece of electronics you bought recently. I think most of the equipment around me was made in China. I don't know under what circumstances, to be honest with you. In our interviews, some large multinational organizations have done the analysis on true economic costs of Scope 3 emissions. And again, some of the more surprising people were much better organized than you might think. Organizations are motivated to do that kind of analysis if they're consumer facing. Because, as I say, there is now a kind of a widespread, particularly among younger people, a widespread awareness that we're actually going to make choices in the shops or online about what type of things they're going to buy. Next slide there. These are for you now, Yvonne.
Okay, so we're going to look at the conclusions. Okay, so after all the research, after doing a literature review, after interviewing people face to face, semi-structured interviews, focus groups, what came out of the overall research? Well, to put it in a nutshell, awareness of Scope 3 emissions and the underlying concepts involved in Scope 3 emissions, very, very little understanding. Now, this report was published only at the start of this year, but the research had been done in the previous year. I feel that we may have moved on, but that'll be for another day in terms of Scope 3. Key individuals such as senior managers and those heavily involved, say, in environmental consultancy, they were very much aware of the issues and really of the potential coming regulations. But the predominant focus really on the business organisation is what has always been in relation to the existence, which is the shareholders' wealth and the organisation making profit. Now, some of the organizations who had gone in wholeheartedly into sustainability had started to find that it was costly, but the long-term investment could be much more beneficial, but it was a long-term investment. All the serious commentators we spoke to cited cost really as the principal barrier to achieving decarbonisation of the value chain. And if I was to link some of this back to what Aidan has been talking about, when we spoke to some people in the transport and logistics industry, one of the gentlemen spoke about, and Aidan, I hope this is correct, that an EV would cost, an ordinary trailer would cost around 120,000. An EV is up around 420,000. Which is very difficult for smaller transport and logistics organizations to afford. Other issues were proper education, right? Identifying the complexity of the whole sustainability process, the lack of skills, and the lack of real urgency to streamline the process, even with regulations in place. And also, it was important for the government to be supporting it in a financial way, and also, a complete awareness. Is it better just to, pay the penalties, as opposed to trying to invest long term in the sustainable processes that manage Scope 3 emissions properly? Next screen there, please, Fergal. So the conclusions and future research. This research really has identified really a critical need for the upskilling and the support of businesses and for effective implementation of the measures to reduce the carbon footprint. So we are going to revisit this research with a similar group, say, later on this year or early next year, to see what developments have actually taken place, what legislation has been put in place, what infrastructure, as Aidan talked about there, has been put in place, to see how one development effect has progressed since we did it. And I would just like to thank you all for listening to it, both Gerald and myself, and welcome any questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, everyone. I know we're right on our time, so I thank those of you who've joined our presentation this afternoon. But what I'd like to do is go into, for those of you who can stay for a couple of minutes, we'll try and touch on a few of your questions and see if we can give an answer to them. The first one I think is one for you, Aidan. Why is the total budget for EV grants for HGVs so low at 16 million in total? It's not going to put a dent in electrification of freight.
Yeah, thanks, Fergal. Thanks for the question. Going back to what Yvonne said, I mean, the cost differential is massive, you know, and I think that's why the transitionary piece around biomethane is important, because you're looking at a cultural shift. And I think, you know, if organizations are beginning to focus on eco driver training, fuel management, then perhaps, you know, pay a premium for HVO. You know, there's not as big a differential for CNG. You're kind of incorporating that mentality for change. But to go from 150,000 unit to a 400,000 unit is massive. And I think, in fairness, it's a relatively new piece, so they're experimenting with that, the supports that are available. But it's not. We need to start focusing on total cost of operation, and I think, depending on how you can charge an electric vehicle, you can actually make a 400,000 euro for you, but you need to be able to charge the vehicle at night. So your night rate might be 16 cent a kilowatt hour, but a publicly service charge rate is 70 cent a kilowatt hour, which trebles the cost of the vehicle on top, like an operational cost of the vehicle, as well as the cost of the vehicle itself. So every business is different. And in fairness, I think ZEVI are looking to help support the transition with consultation along with the SCAI to help organisations start their business, looking at route optimization and looking to see what type of vehicle suits their particular business.
Aidan, here's another one for you. I don't want to put you in the spot, but I think these numbers were in your deck. Do you know the emissions for each per kilometre for each of EV, HVO, CNG, and hydro? Those numbers were in your deck, weren't they?
I'm not per kilometre, but certainly, like I know we were saying, kind of 56 ton per truck. You know, so
Yeah.
if you're looking at you divide it by 75,000 kilometres on average, I think it's around 0.75. 750 grams per kilometre or something. It works out from a diesel perspective. So I don't have them specifically on the slide there, but you can easily work
Okay.
them out from the slide.
I don't know whether all these questions are coming from the same anonymous attendee. Why hasn't battery swapping been considered like what they're doing in China?
Well, I'll come in. Just, it's not that it hasn't, and that's the other challenge with the decision making. When's the right time to change? The tech is moving at such a pace, and that's one example, for argument's sake, that actually might be more applicable to cars rather than trucks, because the size of the batteries needed for buses and trucks in the early stages of that type of system, it might be a bit more challenging. But it's not to say that it's not going to be or it won't be. But it also complicates the reason why people aren't making decisions right now.
The next question, I must admit I don't get, but has tire wear and brake disc dust been considered in emissions proven to cause salmon die-off, 6 ppd, quinone, and other human health concerns? I don't know whether we need to come back on that one, Aidan, or whether whether that's something you've any input into.
Well, it's above my pay grade, I'd say. I'm more
Yeah.
interested in the general piece, but you know, I think everything needs to be considered. You know, and it was great they did away with smokeless, brought in smokeless fuel, which helped with you know, everybody's breathing and stuff like that. So I take the point, but at the end of the day, the bigger picture here is the broader transition in terms of what we're focusing on.
This one is covering the space that Yvonne and Gerald talked about, and it's around the fact that CSRD rules were eased recently from the EU. With the setback to mandatory reporting on CSRD rules, will this delay operators to report on why? Will this be a demand of customers, and they'll have to do it anyway or lose business? Have you any comments, Gerald?
I haven't. We have indeed. We were actually very disappointed when we saw that kind of drawback. It did have. I think it will have an impact, because unless the rules are being implemented, I think it has given a breathing space. I don't mind it giving a breathing space for people to get organised, but we were very disappointed to see that. And I do believe that it will impact implementation.
But this happens everywhere. I mean, you think the nitrates directive on the farms there. I mean, Irish politicians and farmers keep saying, "Oh, we must keep this," and everyone else in Europe has to go by different rules. I mean, there's very little. I mean, that wouldn't be popular with farmers to say that now, but it's a fact. We need to get our act together on these things,
Okay, thanks. And the last comment or question that I saw, again, it's anonymous. Could short-haul electric aviation replace a lot of ground transport quicker and cheaper than electrification of ground transport? Aidan, I don't know whether you have any comment on that, or whether that's one we could come back on. It's obviously referring to a link which
Fergal, we spoke to
we spoke to some of the aviation. Gerald, you might.
We spoke to somebody who was very, very clued in, a guy over in Texas working with a big multinational, but he said that things like bio, or what we call better sustainable fuel for ships and for planes is still, the expense is like it's quadruple the expense. And there's no real practical suggestion that that's going to happen anytime soon. But I mean, as Aidan has been saying, the pace of technology is such that you might be surprised at how fast these things suddenly come up. But you're not going to do that in a hurry. And I mean, trucks are going to have to roll into towns and load up the local Centra or Spar or whatever in the same way as they always did, I think.
And we asked one of people we were interviewing about the the batteries and the EV version for the planes, and he said it probably wouldn't get you off the runway right now. If you were to take Shannon, you'd get from the leaving gate maybe to the end of the runway right now.
And I would
maybe that was
suspect
being facetious, I don't know.
I would suspect that given the distances involved in Ireland, that last comment might be more to do with the US and the vast distances that they cover in.
And I think it's like the drones, you can drop. Amazon we're doing deliveries on drone. I don't know what and there's somebody in Dublin delivering donuts on drones. But I don't know. But I mean, so one of our consultant guys pointed out, they're doing things like driving from Sweden down to Barcelona. And Ireland is quite a small country. We're actually perfect for electrification if we thought about it. But the example of the guys spending 130 on a tractor, a diesel tractor, and then 430 on the electric one, and then all of a sudden the price of electricity shot up, and all their accounts were all over the place. Again, we live in a very uncertain world. Certainly, we're waiting for the news at 9 o'clock tonight to see what happens.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. I want to thank Aidan, Yvonne, and Gerald for their fascinating insights on decarbonising road transport, and also the broader supply chain and the challenges in Scope 3. But particularly, I want to thank those of you who took time out of your day to look at us today. And just bear in mind that Logistics and Supply Chain Skills Week has a few more days to run. Check out the website for the calendar of events, and you might find something of interest to you. And everyone, have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fergal.
Thanks, Fergal. Thanks, Aidan. Thanks, Gerald.